Hello and welcome everybody to the 10th episode of the Void Wave podcast. And today we're going to return to the subject of antinatalism. And we are going to discuss the ultimate guide to antinatalist argumentation, I think it is called. It's a really long, really long name. It's the ultimate antinatalism argument guide. Okay.
Yeah, that's the official name.
That's the official name.
That's the official name.
And we want to start with a little thanks to the author, or I think it's a collaborative project, but the person who took the initiative and started putting this document together, who is called a texting person misspelled with the O and the S switch, so it's texting person on Reddit. So thank you very much for doing the write-up and taking the initiative. And yeah, this document is massive by now.
Yeah, it's up to 11,000 words, 30 pages. Obviously, it's not as long as most antinatalism books, but it's kind of a lot of these different antinatalism texts and videos kind of distilled into a single guide. And this is structured in a way that it presents, it has various sections, obviously, and it's presented as a sort of, first it talks about this definition and kind of arguments for antinatalism, and then it kind of goes into counter arguments to antinatalism. So this is sort of set up as a debate guide. If you were trying to defend antinatalism in an online or a live debate, you could use the arguments that are here. So I see this guide not as like a foundational text or as an informative text or a piece of philosophy like Better Never to Have Been by David Benatar, or all the work in negative bioethics that Cabrera has done. I see this as a piece of activism. So, this guide was made for people to take it and use it to kind of spread the word of antinatalism, I would say.
Yeah. I agree with that. Like it's basically like a handbook on how to express your antinatalist beliefs in a coherent and structured manner.
Yeah,
I guess what I would call it.
Yeah, it's funny because a lot of people kind of read, say, David Benatar's work or Cabrera work, or others who kind of have also antinatalist views. We talk about Emil Cioran, the Romanian, or Schopenhauer. They sometimes look at those books as encouragements to activism, right? This person said this, and I agree that with this person that this is correct, so I'm supposed to go out and kind of fight this battle, right? Make sure this truth goes out and that the world becomes more ethical, right? But if somebody like Benatar or if another philosopher writes a book like he does, he's not necessarily saying to people that they should go out and spread the word, right? Sometimes, and I guess most times, even works of ethical philosophy, they just are, they're just kind of arguments in themselves, which then, maybe for a later edition we'll have the counter arguments, etc. But nothing in those works carries within it the demand for people to do activism on behalf of its conclusions, right? This document is set up as to be a call to activism, I would say, because it's basically saying, this is antinatalism. This is why it should be an antinatalist, and this is how to argue for its position, right? So it's a different type of text. It's not like something that would be presented for a research for PhD, for example, right?
Oh yeah, it's definitely not like an academic text at all. Like it's really more like a call to action.
It reminds me a lot of texts on veganism, who also. Obviously there's philosophical works about veganism, but there's also, I would say the bulk of writing and of discourse on veganism is centered around activism, right? On fixing the wrong that was found. And this work kind of sits within that realm. So in terms of antinatalism, it's very refreshing to have something like this, because most of the, the written word on antinatalism is from a purely kind of philosophical position. Here are the arguments, or here's justification, here's the kind of the analytical work behind it, but ultimately, the author doesn't state whether this is something that should be brought to existence or that should have people going out and carrying this to the world. right? But
Yeah.
but this work is different, completely different. And it's also collaborative, which is something we rarely see in other antinatalist written works, where usually
True.
maximum you have like two, three authors sometimes, but very rarely, usually just a single person working.
Yeah, unless it's like a collection of essays or something.
Yeah, a
like
collection
that.
of
But
essays.
usually it's monographs
Yeah, monographs.
written by one or two people. Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing what I found more collaborative would be, and this is not kind of strictly antinatalism, would be within the realm of, for example, negative utilitarians, where there's like a very tight group of negative utilitarian philosophers and writers. And, you know, if you read the book from one of them, that book has a lot of references to books from another writer from the same group, and then vice versa. So it does feel a bit like all the books are from a single author, but very collaborative. This doesn't happen in, for example, antinatalism at all. But
So far,
yeah. We could be moving to something different in the future.
Yeah, it's also more of a political text, I'd say, because one of the section about the arguments is specifically about making political arguments for antinatalism, and there's also one section about religious arguments.
Yeah.
In favor of it. And yeah, we are not sure how far we are going to get through the guide. We're just going to start with the beginning and see how far we can take it in one episode, because, I mean, we have time constraints. We don't want to make it like a 3-hour long episode. So yeah, we're just going to see how far we can get.
By the way, if you want to find it, just Google The Ultimate Antinatalism Argument Guide. And that's literally the first result will be a link to Reddit. Even I think you'll probably, you know, kind of just typing exact like that, you will find it.
Yeah. You can also put like a link in the description.
Yes.
I guess.
On YouTube only.
Oh yeah, on YouTube. Yeah, it's difficult on other platforms, which is a bit annoying, but you know, that's how it is.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's start in the beginning.
Yeah. And so the first section is simply called Understanding Antinatalism, and it starts out with a very, you know, broad and kind of the standard definition of what antinatalism is, which is often in my opinion, a little bit clunky and technical sounding definition of that it's an ethical position that assigns negative value to birth, which is not wrong. I just think it's a bit of a clunky way of putting it.
Yeah.
And the text does a good job in immediately explaining that what this entails is that people ought to abstain from procreation. And yeah, I think there's not much to discuss here. I think if you're already interested in antinatalism and listen to this podcast, you should probably know this definition, or should have come across it.
Yeah.
At one point. Yeah.
It also talks about that for some antinatalism, this kind of restriction on procreation should apply to other sentient beings, or for other sentient beings, it's also morally bad. It mentions aphilism as being that kind, but this is, in my opinion, a common misconception, because I think most kind of popular, well, within the realm of antinatalism, most popular antinatalist authors always include animals by default anyway. It's usually that animals are not mentioned, because in most cases it's seen as immoral to also meddle with animal affairs, if you will. So, you know, that's why I think most, Benatar has said his work extends to animals. Cabrera has mentioned that his work extends to animals, but we shouldn't mess with them. So I think...
Yeah, he puts it a little bit differently, right? Because he makes a point about, you know, social contract theory, which we really don't have time to go too deeply into. But, you know, there's some difficulties with animals in social contract theory, and he has another way of addressing the animal issue.
Yeah. And for example, Patricia McCormack, when she talks about antinatalism, she doesn't include animals because she says that it's impossible with so different, such different species, right, between humans and non-human animals, that it's impossible for us to say that procreation is bad for them or right, which is not an opinion I agree with, but just to kind of give, you know, just throw more stuff into this cauldron of this definition. But I think in general, the majority of people who talk about antinatalism and who write about antinatalism would say that antinatalism includes other sentient creatures. In fact, most of the arguments on this list would apply to other sentient beings. So
Oh yeah, except for, of course, the political and religious arguments, right? Because
yeah, rabbits are not going to be wage slaves, right? So
right,
or
they're going to be like the object of wage slavery.
Yeah, even
like
though
there
was the monkeys, right? The people who do crops of coconuts, they were using the monkeys as labor to get the coconuts from the trees.
But that's like
that's
unpaid slavery.
Yeah, that's actual slavery.
Non-wage slavery.
Yeah, that's non-wage slavery. I don't think communism fixes that, or capitalism fixes that. Anyway, so the next all right, we already raised so many comments about the single paragraph. This is going to be a long podcast.
It's going to be a long one, boys.
Yeah. Why should I be an antinatalist is the next question. So they talk about, the first argument is the goal. They say that the goal of antinatalism is to prevent suffering. So if you don't procreate, you're not bringing more people into this world to suffer like the existing beings, in this case, I guess humans, suffer. And
yeah, I mean, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, the prevention of suffering angle, that's certainly one angle you can take in making your antinatalist argument, but it's obviously not the only angle you can take to tackle the issue of procreation.
Yeah. They also talk about the consent argument in this case. Well, people are born without their consent. So that's a good reason to be an antinatalist. For me, they probably could have taken out this bit about being an antinatalist, because they go into the argumentation later, which goes into much more detail. And if I was just seeing antinatalism for the first time, I would probably raise objections at suffering and say, maybe I say, well, my life is great or something.
Yeah, it's just kind of thrown out there without much explanation. But I think like when a person just wants to know like a very quick, easy rundown of why someone might take this position, I think this is okay to spoiler or tease the argument a little bit here.
I think it's also a good argument because you just say up front that it's about preventing suffering and not acting meaningfully on another person's life, in this case very meaningfully, because you're creating them from nothing without their consent. And I think maybe if somebody asked you why they should, ask one of us or another antinatist why they should be an antinatalist in themselves, it's good to have this sort of stuff just to throw out there immediately, so people don't think, oh, you hate people, or you hate babies or whatever, right? So you immediately start from reduced suffering, which is something that we all can agree on. I think most people can agree that suffering should be reduced, and most people can agree that people shouldn't make decisions on other people's behalf if they don't have their consent or can assume their consent. So these are kind of two very quick sound bites you can just throw out to kind of frame from the beginning that you're not kind of a Bond villain that wants to blow up the world. Yeah,
exactly. It's basically stating that antinatalism is usually coming from a place of compassion. Yeah. And I would have liked them to use the word compassion there, but I guess prevention of suffering is fine as well.
Yeah. Yes. Compassion appears one time in this document, the word. But it's a word that I like to use a lot with antinatalism.
Yeah. There's that. And the next section is then a little bit about the distinction between antinatalism and a promortalism. Yeah. Which some people get a little bit confused about what the relationship between these two ethical positions is. And the document, first of all, makes it clear that there is a difference between antinatalism and promortalism. They are not the same position. And philosophers like David Benatar, he talks about this at length and basically repeats this point in every single interview he does, just to hammer his point home that antinatalism is about preventing births, whereas promortalism is about, the question of whether or not it's good or bad to continue an already existing life. So it's about the question of death. Yeah.
I think the crossover is mostly because there are a lot of shared arguments for both positions, right?
And, I think so too.
Yeah, and if you say, well, we as antinatalists, we want to reduce suffering because living is objectively, I hate to say this word, objectively bad, without getting into a huge argumentation of why it's objectively bad. But let's take that antinatalistic position that life is objectively bad, and then well, how about the people living? If their life is bad, should we encourage them to end their lives? It kind of shares some common ground, but to me, antinatalism and promortalism are both kind of philosophies focused on what is an ethical conduct that matches these kind of considerations or these things we hold to be facts, and they but even though they have like the same base, they splinter in completely different ways, in my opinion. I think somebody could be both things, and one could be one thing or the other thing. One doesn't follow from the other, right?
Like they're not mutually exclusive positions or anything, but it's just important to point this out, that it's not the same position with different words, right? Yeah. Because they both deal with very different scenarios, right? In one scenario, like a child doesn't exist yet, and you're asking the question of, okay, should I bring this person into existence or not? And in the other situation, you have an already existing person thinking about whether or not it's good or bad to continue their own life, right? Yeah. And that's the main difference.
So in this kind of intro, it talks about antinatalism versus conditional natalism. Now, conditional natalism is one of those expressions that I think anybody outside the antinatalism world would ever use, by the way.
I've never heard this one before, but I think it's an apt description of
it's a good description.
What it's supposed to mean, right?
Yeah.
And I think that generally most people that I encounter in my daily life, I would describe them as conditional natalists, as in they don't think procreation is wrong, but they acknowledge that there are certain situations in which bringing a new person into existence is bad, right?
Yeah. We talked about this on our episode 4 when we did the antinatalist kind of news and community, and we talked about a lot of the content that gets put out in the antinatalism channels, like on the subreddit or the subreddits that talk about antinatalism and the Facebook groups. There's a lot of stuff about this, right? Stuff about, look at these people with 8 kids and they're having another kid. They can barely afford to have this kid. And we talked about, how that argument is an argument that I guess you could call it conditional natalism, which say, it's okay to have babies if you have like these certain, you can match these certain conditions. Conditional natalism is a position that's like pretty much a common sense position. Or, not that I agree with it because I am an antinatalist, but it's a position that, as you said, most people would agree, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, it's, there's a lot of shock value in this. Every time they're parents with kind of congenital disabilities who decide to have kids anyway, this stuff will show up on the online version of the Daily Mail. People will share it on the groups and look at these monsters having a baby when they knew it was going to be born without arms or something. And
it often goes into like the eugenics argument, of course. Yeah. Is it okay that if you have hereditary diseases that are known, is it okay to have a child or not? And this is usually the direction these kind of arguments go. Yeah, it's not antinatalism, and it doesn't belong in antinatalism. And I think, for example, even on the subreddit on antinatalism, which has 70,000 subscribers or 100,000 subscribers, getting very big, there's a lot of people posting this stuff and getting lots of upvotes as well. And it's featured here in the argumentation section too as well. I think, if I'm not mistaken. Oh no, it's in the thought experiment section. Yeah. But we're gonna get to that later.
Yeah, it's good that they put this up front because it's such a common sense position that literally almost everybody in the world could call themselves an antinatalist if all it took was thinking that people with less than ideal circumstances should breed or not. I mean, even governments engage in conditional natalism, for example, right? And the medical profession, right?
Yeah, I mean, everybody who makes use of some kind of birth control or contraception is basically a conditional natalist in this sense.
Yeah, even if the condition is basically I can't be bothered to raise a child, right?
Yeah, personal preference.
Yeah,
right?
personal preference.
That's a condition.
Right? Yeah,
that's a condition.
All right. Next one. Do antinatalists support forced sterilization?
Yeah, that's a difficult one always
Yeah,
to
that's
talk
a
about
difficult one.
because that the position that is espoused here in the document is basically, well, some antinatalists do, some don't, which is true. But I'd love to have this section maybe a little bit more expanded upon, because this is a very difficult situation, you know.
Yeah.
How do you justify taking antinatalism beyond this purely voluntaristic conception, right? Where it's about your own personal decision not to have a child, and
Yeah.
you know, how do you justify imposing that onto another person, right?
Yeah. I mean,
This is a really difficult situation.
I can't. I think you'd have to go into some pretty messed up utilitarian arguments to support forced sterilization.
Yeah, that's usually, yeah, that's basically what we talked about also in our episode 4, where we did the little news roundup on antinatalism.
Yeah.
That's usually like these utilitarian sounding arguments that go into this direction.
Yeah.
Where, you know, the means
Yeah.
means are justified by the ends.
Yeah, if you think about antinatalism as reducing suffering, which is basically what this text says right at the beginning, forced sterilization would cause massive suffering in the world for a lot of people, and for a long time as well. And the only way to justify it would be to think of future generations who wouldn't be born, right? So
True.
you're doing some very messed up mental gymnastics, where you're taking the potential suffering of the future into account to the suffering of present actual beings. So if you were getting into the whole discussion about consent and about the pleasure, the pain and pleasure of unborn people, you would certainly get, with forced sterilization, you would start getting into some, you know, really very confusing and very difficult to justify mental gymnastics for this.
Yeah, again, it really only works if you're having this ends justify the means approach, and neither of us are fans of utilitarianism.
Yeah.
In particular.
Yeah, early 20th century American society tried to ban alcohol, right?
True.
For the good of the community, and they couldn't, and they had to walk it back. They tried to wage the war on drugs, which I'm happy to say, I think the drugs won last night. The winner of the war on drugs has been drugs. But while the war on drugs was going on, it caused massive suffering to the people of the United States, you know, all sorts.
That's part of the calculation problem.
Yeah.
Like, what if your predictions don't line up, and you know, the measures you take end up, you know, worsening the situation instead of making it better, right?
Yeah,
and I think that's a good argument against like a practical implementation of forced sterilizations.
Yeah.
Which is just crazy sounding.
You can't win, and also I don't think you can win, right? It would have to be.
No, of course not.
It would have to be the worst society ever created to win this battle, and you know, the drugs won, and for example, and people are much more passionate about making babies than they are about having drugs. I know that for sure. So
at least equally enthusiastic.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
Yeah, not same people are enthusiastic about both, but you know, let's say the majority of the population has more positive feeling. There's more people from the majority of the population who have positive feelings about making babies than there are about doing drugs, right? More people would risk going to jail to have a baby than the same for drugs. I mean, excluding like hardcore addicts, but that's not the majority of population anyway.
Yeah. Then the last section of this little introductory paragraph is basically just a definition of what suffering is, because people often, you know, start splitting hairs about what is a suffering and what is not a suffering. And the definition provided here is basically any experience that is deemed undesirable by the person who is experiencing it is constituting a suffering.
Yeah.
I broadly agree with that, because I think suffering is a very subjective thing, and of course there are certain forms of suffering which are near universal, but near universal among human beings, that is. But there's also always the possibility that there is like the odd masochist who really enjoys something that another person would consider the most horrible suffering imaginable.
Yeah, it's also always on a personal level, right?
Yeah.
Subjective, there's suffering objectively in life, but it's subjective the shape it takes for each person, right?
Yeah, because experience is subjective, right? So you cannot really rid yourself of that subjective element.
Yeah, a masochist who likes being humiliated, for example, does not suffer with humiliation, right?
True.
So, whereas other people will suffer by being humiliated. So, it's subjective. It doesn't mean that masochists are excluded from the suffering group. I'm sure there's stuff they wouldn't like to happen to them. And even if they would like all bad things to happen to them, maybe bad stuff not happening to them is the suffering in itself, right? Which is the privation of pleasure, which we all go through, right? That's one of the definitions of boredom.
Yeah, the masochist is it's an odd case because like the suffering to them is the pleasure. So maybe this was a bad example to bring up, but yeah.
Yeah, but the
masochists are weird in that regard.
But they usually their kind of their range of suffering turned into pleasure is always like a very specific range of human experience, right? It's not like everything, right? Yeah, it's not like everything. All right, we managed to do one page in 20-something minutes. We at a good pace to finish this by Christmas, I think. Okay, so
we still have time till Christmas.
Yeah, of course.
I'm sure we manage.
So the next bit is quite long, and it's called arguments, and it lists quite a lot of arguments for antinatalism. It's only a page, but there's quite a lot of them. Let's kind of have a look. I think they include like most things in it, but there's a bit of repetition if we really think about it.
Yeah.
All right. So it starts. I don't think it's in any particular order. It's just kind of a dump of arguments. The first one is about unborn people not caring about pleasure. Therefore, there is no reason to reproduce since the unborn person does not even desire life.
Yeah, I mean,
it's true, but
yeah, it really depends on what your understanding of an unborn person, quote unquote, is. And in this argument, it's basically like a factual understanding of non-existence. By which I mean that you understand that the unborn person is not really a person. It doesn't exist yet, or they don't exist yet. So they don't have desire or care about anything, right?
Yeah.
Because they don't exist. So
it certainly doesn't suffer.
Basically.
It doesn't suffer from lack of life, for example.
Yeah.
Which is kind of the flip, the negative argument from this. So I would say this argument is not the greatest argument to talk about people who've never thought about antinatalism.
Yeah, I don't like this one as much because it's just hard to make people understand, like dealing with potential people or like this hypothetical construct or theoretical construct of an unborn person and how that factors into your ethical concerns is just really, really difficult to communicate sometimes. Because people will just often respond with like, what do you mean? The person doesn't exist yet, right?
Yeah.
That's going to be one of the responses, which I think the document addresses later on.
Yeah, they address it later on. But to me, this is not how I would lead the discussion into antinatalism. All right.
Me neither. It's a difficult argument to make.
Yeah, it's kind of for the philosophy nerds, I think.
Yeah, because you have to presuppose a certain understanding of non-existence, and it gets difficult.
Yeah, non-existence is... And look, we see this all the time in the Discord server we frequent, right? Non-existence is a really hard concept to talk about and philosophize about and kind of construct arguments about. And I think most people can go through their whole life without pondering non-existence. So I think this is one like for the kind of philosophy-minded people, I would say, or people that kind of think about this sort of stuff. Yeah.
Definitely one more for a person who's already kind of invested into the idea of ethics.
Or in ethics, in ethics you think about non-existing people, right? A lot, and it's you learn to think about it or kind of to argument about it and to kind of construct a persona, right? Construct a non-persona about it. All right, let's go to B. Creating a life that might be positive overall or might not be is not your risk to take, since someone else is suffering the consequences and you never received consent. So this is a long sentence. I think this one is a bit better, although there's like the I don't know if I can't recall if they're going to the thought experiment of kind of people betting money on your behalf, right?
Yeah, I mean, this argument, I think it's really two arguments bundled into one, because like on the one hand, it's making the argument from risk, that, you know, because the future is uncertain and you cannot guarantee that your child will be free from suffering or whatever. It's a bad gamble to make. And then on the other hand, there's the consent argument bundled into it, that procreation is necessarily an aconsensual or non-consensual act on the part of the person who is being procreated, right? Who's being born.
Yeah. So it's kind of two arguments into one, and it's a pretty long sentence. So maybe this one needs to be kind of split into two.
Yeah, especially because I believe the risk argument is repeated several times later on. So maybe this could be condensed into one.
Okay, so argument C. Birthing people means they will need to work someday via school, a job, emotional labor, paying taxes. There's no way around it without suffering, so they're essentially forced into a social contract without consent. So I like the second part of this one. I don't like the first part, because that's very specific. That's very specific for our current social organization, and only for a specific social class in that social organization, right?
It's true.
I mean, there's people who don't need to work, right?
Yeah, it's called the bourgeoisie, guys.
They
don't have to work necessarily. They have people working for them.
Yeah.
So they're kind of out of the whole issue.
The second part, I think, is okay when it talks about you're forced into a social contract without consent, right?
Yeah, it's basically a repetition of the consent argument again, but, you know, looked at from a different angle, and this time from the angle of social contract theory.
Yeah.
And I broadly agree with it, but I think the way it is phrased here, like this emphasis on school or work, I don't really know if this is necessary, because yes, of course, it's true that, you know, living always is a struggle and it requires an effort on your part. You know, if you want to maintain your existence, you have to do something. That's true. But the real issue here, or the meat of the argument, is in the second half when it comes to the social contract.
Homeostasis requires work to maintain, even if it's just shoving food in your mouth that other people got for you, right?
Yeah, we're not perpetuum mobilis, or whatever it's called.
Yes, we're not a rock, right? You're not birthing rocks. So I'm not keen on this one, because this one can be very easily spun into the previous page, conditional natalism, where somebody could say...
I was thinking about that, actually.
Yeah,
that it's kind of...
But I'm rich, right?
Yeah.
My father is Jeff Bezos, right? I only work if I have to. Maybe I won't even learn to read or something. I don't know.
Yeah, like this is really maybe a conditional antinatalist argument, not so much conditional natalism, but conditional antinatalism.
And to me, the issue,
not the strongest argument.
To me, the issue is if you say something like this as an argument, then people will pick it up and they will go back. Wait a minute! You said it wasn't conditional natalism.
Yeah.
Right? So you're kind of screwed.
That's a bit of an issue, definitely.
Yeah. Right. Let's go for D. There are already people who need to be adopted and cared for. It is unethical to create more people while there are still others who are suffering and need help. And then it goes into a bit of arguments on how adoption is, I would say, both feasible and the same level of, not inferior to biological families in terms of creating bonds. So this is, again, kind of, I think it's a good common sense argument, but it could go into conditional antinatalism, right? Because you could come from a society that has like no babies for adoption. It could exist, right? We could imagine that society existing, and then you could say, well, would then it be okay if there's no babies for adoption for us to make more babies? And then you have to go to another argument, right? So it's a bit. I'm not too fond of it either.
Yeah, like the way I look at it is that, like, I'm not sure this is even an argument in favor of antinatalism, precisely because I support adoption. I think it's a good choice for people who realize that having biological children is bad, but who nonetheless want kids, right? It's more of a remedy to this specific group of people, but it's not really an argument in favor of antinatalism.
Yeah. There's plenty of people who have kind of parent instincts or nurturing instincts towards children or teenagers, or want to have that kind of relationship with another human being, where they're seen as a parent. And you could say, as a common sense argument, not as an antinatalist, you can just say, well, adoption is valid and good, and you kind of giving something that this child would otherwise not have. You also get it back yourself, the love, the bond, all that stuff, right? But it's not antinatalism.
Yeah, I mean, it's just difficult because like if you're presupposing a situation in which adoption is possible, like you're already conceding that there has to be some people who procreate, right? Because otherwise
a surplus.
You couldn't adopt, right? And it has to be a surplus of children.
Yeah,
which is horrible to say, but yeah.
That's
more basically the situation you have to presuppose in order for this to work, and
there's more offer than
the
demand
argument crumbles.
of children.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is so
this
putting
argument
this in business language.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But there's kind of baby farms in Ukraine, right?
Yeah, which is disgusting. It's horrible.
So I think the logic of capitalism can be applied to almost anything in the world we live in, anyway. So.
Oh yeah, it is. Yeah. Unfortunately.
So anyway, I think D is a route for antinatalists to take in their lives, in their personal lives, if they have kind of parenting instincts and they feel that it would bring more joy to their lives. They can do a double good by adopting, which is good for the child, I guess in most cases, and they become a parent themselves without having to violate their antinatalist principles. Is it an antinatalist argument? No, not really. It's just like a route for antinatalists to take. All right, let's go to E. More people means more resource consumption and more potential harm to others who are already alive, even indirectly via pollution or some other means.
Yeah, E and argument F, I would bundle together actually, because F is very similar in that it's about people creating more people means there's much more of a risk of direct or indirect harm coming to others, right?
Yeah.
Just that argument E is looking at it from a more of an environmental perspective, where it's about pollution and resource consumption and stuff. And in argument F, it's more generally, right, about that there is a chance that your child might do something that harms another person.
Yeah.
Which I would bundle together as like the misanthropic argument. I guess that's what David Benatar calls it, which doesn't mean that you hate people. It just means that creating a new person might be a harm to others.
Yeah.
And I think this is a valid argument because you really have no idea what your child might turn out to be.
Yes, and your child's children, right? Or the people your child grows up to influence or lead to. Essentially, when you bring a child to the world, you've lost control of it pretty much from the beginning, right? You have a lot of control when it's still a toddler, and then progressively less and less control until that person becomes mostly independent from you or completely independent from you. And at that point, whatever happens, it's also your fault, yeah, because you created, you set the wheels in motion that those wheels otherwise would not be in motion or even exist, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's just a very, very strict causal relationship between you making the decision to have a child and then what happens in that child's life, right?
Yeah,
whether that's good or bad.
Yeah,
that's a responsibility you have to carry.
Yeah, that reminds me of this trope from martial arts stories and martial arts, first stories and then movies, of course, where I think this is completely bullshit, by the way, right? It's something that they made to kind of give some kind of dramatic impact to these martial arts stories, kind of samurai, ninja stories and stuff, where it says that according to Japanese tradition, and this can change to Chinese or whatever kind of bit of kind of esoteric culture you want to put in, if you save somebody's life, then you're responsible for the deeds of that person until they die, right? And this creates like a, you put this in the beginning of the movie, like the master saving somebody else's life, and then they have to take this person under their wing to make sure they don't do bad stuff, and kind of make them a better person because now they're responsible, right? And this is, look, I think this is completely, I don't think this saying even exists like in China or Japan or whatever. I think this is they just created to kind of create the story, a plot line to make the story move. But if you think about this, which a lot of people would agree with, right? With babies, it's an even bigger bond, right? It's an even bigger bond because if in the saving a person's life, you could say, well, this person didn't want to die, I saved them, so I did a good thing for somebody who wanted the good thing, right? They had the consent of me saving their lives. In the case of the babies, you set the wheels in motion of this responsibility for bad acts, or bad acts whether they're conscious or unconscious, like just consuming resources, right? And you're fully responsible for it, right? And you brought life into the world that might go and do bad things. I mean, will very likely do bad things just the way the life is structured with consumption of goods, etc., and exploitation.
It doesn't necessarily have to be like intentionally bad. It's just sometimes like a byproduct of maintaining your own existence.
Yeah, of course. And you did this not because this person that now exists wanted you to do it for them, right? Unlike the samurai story where you're saving somebody's life because they would like to continue living. Sorry to bring this kind of very low culture example.
Now I'm curious about it.
There's so many stories like this. So many stories with this stuff. Yeah.
I think like this could make sense like in a feudal society where you have serfdom and people are really like generally being bonded to another person who's their master essentially.
Yeah.
Like I could see this being a real thing, but I don't know. I'd have to look it up.
Okay, we're almost through this page.
Yeah. let's skip F since again I think
F
it's really similar to E.
Yeah.
And move into G.
Loving life comes with a fear of losing it and a fear of death. Since there's no way to completely avoid the scenarios, no one can be truly happy knowing it can and will all be lost. I love this argument very much.
Yes, me too. I think this is one of the most important arguments to make.
Yes.
Because it's basically about the problem of death, right?
Yes.
The issue with mortality, that being is inherently a terminal structure, which always ends in death. Like as far as we know, like there is no creature, certainly not humans, who can live forever. So this is something that everybody has to confront at one point or another, and it's a terrifying thing. And yeah, I think it's a good argument because why on earth would you put a person into this position where they have to face their own mortality in the first place? Right?
Yeah, and I think they're talking about mortality, but also about the end of the good things. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's not just life that's finite. It's really all things. Even the universe itself is in a sense finite.
Yeah. I'm gonna go.
All the atoms.
Yeah, will cease
all
to
the
exist.
Atoms and protons decay at some point, like trillions of years into the future.
All the energy dissipates, etc.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for going lowbrow again. Okay, but there was a meme going around. I don't know if it's a meme, but stuff people were copy pasting all over the internet and chat rooms and stuff, and it went something like this. At one point, you played with your childhood friends for the last time, and none of you knew it was the last time you were playing together. Something like this, right? And people were like, "Oh my God, I remember," and I never seen those people again. And you could apply this to anything, right?
Yeah, it's really true.
Yeah.
You can really apply this to anything.
Yeah, at one point you had this wonderful time with your boyfriend or girlfriend, and it was the last time you ever saw each other again, right? And that's it. Yeah. And for everything else, right? Yeah. You did this thing which you're passionate about because now your fingers have arthritis and you cannot do this thing again, right? Playing an instrument or everything ends. Ultimately, life ends, but within the life ending, there's all the other ends as things stop existing for you as possibilities, things which might give you pleasure or meaning, and they too will end. And by bringing life into the world, you're saying to somebody, well, you're gonna suffer this for sure. It's inevitable, no matter how rich you are. Yeah.
The psychological issue this problem causes is that, like, they run very deep, and there's antinatalist philosophers who talked about this at length, like Zapfe, of course, and there was always Becker, who wasn't exactly an antinatalist, but he wrote a lot on death, and he looked at it in kind of a similar way that Zapfe did, that we have all of these mental mechanisms were set in place in order to distract us or make us cope with this knowledge of certainty of death, right?
Yeah.
And it's just a very shitty position to put somebody into.
Yeah, it's also
else to put it.
One of my favorite arguments, because then people say, well, how about people who enjoy life? And then you could say, well, everything they enjoy about life, they will have to learn how to live without it. Yeah. For one reason or another, right? Maybe they love building little sculptures with their matchsticks or whatever, right? And there'll come a point when their hands shake and they can't do it anymore. Whatever it is, it will end.
Yeah, it might be even just something very trivial or banal, like your job, something you do on a daily basis and you enjoy, or meeting up with friends who also will have to die at some point, and if they die before you're gonna have to deal with that, right?
Yeah.
That you're never going to see this person again.
Or
that's not a pretty thing.
Yeah, a very strong argument is, if you parent a child, you create a child, and if your relationship is really good, like a really strong bonded family, everything is going like you're a great parent. The child is also kind of very bonded to you as parents and respect you and kind of want to be part of the family group, which not always happens, but this is not an ideal scenario. At least your child will have to deal with your death, right? And this is like an ideal scenario, right? So what's the other option? Be a shitty parent, so they don't they don't care that you die.
So they don't care about.
Yeah, but that has its own trauma, right? That has its own suffering and trauma attached to it. And either way, you one or the other, right?
Yeah. Can't have nice things forever. Yeah. Basically.
All right. Argument I. Even if one's children are happy, their children might not be, or their children's children could suffer. Ultimately, the blame for all of that suffering lie with the original parents. And of course, with all the blame lies with whatever amphibian creature tried to walk on land, the bastard.
That motherfucker.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah. I mean,
I blame the primordial slime.
Yeah, whatever single-celled organism decide to become a double-celled organism. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is again, I think, a repeat argument, which is about the uncertainty of the future and the argument from risk, but it's looking at it again from a different angle, where it's not just about first-degree descendants, like what your children are going to do, but also your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, etc., etc.
All right.
Yeah.
J. Societal structures have a massive amount of control over people's lives, and then he kind of talks about stuff like racism, which is kind of racism as a systemic problem, not like individual racism. These factors out of people's control, like surveillance, crime, and just laws, legal barriers, I guess authoritarianism, but also stuff like incompetence from societal structures, or groups being discriminated against, or workers being, or I think you could even go broader than what it says here and just talk about kind of class system or caste system, right? Sometimes it's
basically any kind of societal structure that has a lot of control over people's lives and may have negative effects on them.
Yeah. Right? I think it's not the greatest argument, If you have like a group of people who really believe they're living in the best of possible worlds, they could argue that it's fine, right? It's fine. There's a king, there's the serfs, right? But everybody seems to be unhappy with the structure they live in, right?
Yeah, like this is the classic why pessimists are reactionary type of stuff, where it's basically the world is already as good as it gets, and it's not good. And I also don't think it's a good argument, because this is again more of a like conditional antinatalist argument, right?
Yeah.
Where it is almost presupposed that things like oppressive governments, corporations exerting massive control onto people, cultural institutions like racism,
Yeah.
and stuff, that all exists, right? This is just presupposed, and then you come to the conclusion, therefore it's not good to bring people into existence.
Yeah, it's a bit conditional, isn't it? I mean, you could imagine a society that has done away with racism and done away with sexism and has kind of a single class of people, fully automated luxury. What was it called? Luxury gay space communism or whatever.
Exactly.
And
Star Trek, basically.
Yeah, and it still would be messed up. You could still argue for antinatalism there, but not with this argument. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, again, it's really an argument that hinges on like what the world is right now, and it kind of depends on what do you think are the possibilities for improvement, right?
Yeah.
Whether there is room for improvement or not.
Yeah. And certainly we've seen from history that a lot of people who were building what they thought would be an ideal society, they fathered a lot of children because it would give them motivation to build this ideal world, right? And then the children had to live with the consequences of their acts, unfortunately, right? Because the ideal world was not built, and other people had to put up with it, pretty much. And I made this so generic you could apply it to whatever thing you don't like, whatever society in history you don't like. You can just say yes.
Yeah, this is pretty much always applies, basically.
Yeah, it applies to everything, right? I mean,
it's putting certain demands on your children. What do you expect of them to do with their life, and how they should change society for the better, which are really uncalled for because you're the person who are putting them into this situation in the first place.
Yeah. Right? The letter K. People have needs that require an exploitation and consumption of others' natural resources, consuming others, etc. Right. So this is J, I think. F.
Yeah.
F. Right. So
it's a bit of a mix of both, right?
Yeah.
It's on the one hand, it's a repeat of the creating more people heightens the risk for direct or indirect harm being caused to others, and on the other hand, it's about societal issues.
Okay. L. Climate change. About natural disasters and depleting resources, flooding lands, migrant crisis, having children increases carbon emissions. This is all true. It's again conditional antinatalism, right? It presupposes that if you had a child in the 1500s or whatever, it would be fine because the Industrial Revolution hadn't arrived. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
exactly. Like it's really only it's contingent on the current moment, I guess, right? Because climate change right now is ramping up, and we're seeing more and more of the fallouts of it. So this is right now a good argument, but it might not be a good argument. Like a couple of 100 years in the future, if you're being optimistic, which I'm not, but just supposing there is a future in which climate change has been addressed, like this argument.
The double whammy of climate change and the COVID pandemic, which I hope in the future, if somebody listens to this in the future, it sounds very dated to talk about it. It's now that thing. Remember, it happened in the 2020 back in the day. No, anyway, the double whammy of climate change and the pandemic has made a lot of posts appear on antinatalism places saying, "Wow, living through climate change and through the pandemic, I became an antinatalist." But why? Why? There was always something bad. There was always something. All the other stuff still applies on any point, right?
Yeah. Again, it's just a conditional argument again, and like while these arguments are not necessarily bad, I think like I prefer people to be conditional antinatalists as opposed to just natalists.
Yeah.
Right?
Although if we take this text as being a text to take out into the world to be an activist for antinatalism, if I was against antinatalism, I could shoot down this argument instantly, right? So it's fair to criticize it in that sense.
I think so too, yeah.
M. So we're repeating ourselves. Having enough resources to care for someone cannot prevent suffering, no matter what. Person never consented to how much or what forms of suffering are acceptable, and never wanted to take the trade-off of suffering in exchange for pleasure in the first place, as non-existing people have no desires, so it's unethical to reproduce.
Yeah, this is like the all-star argument because there's a lot of different arguments we already discussed or had on this list bundled together into one. Like the last thing about the unborn not having any desires, that's basically argument A, right? The first thing on the list. Then there's the consent argument and the risk argument from risk. It's basically a repetition.
Yeah, and then we go to N, which kind of is the same one. A person who is born may be discriminated against due to traits they can't control, like race, sexuality, gender, appearance. They never agree to risk this possibility, making reproduction unethical. So this is kind of the same common ground. And I would say a person could be born, with all the let's say dominant traits, which I think in our current world will be, I think white, belonging to the right race, whatever white race means to you. And being cisgendered and male and good looking.
A WASP basically. Yeah. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right?
Yes, one of you people. Yeah.
Guilty as charged.
Yeah. And
although I'm not technically Protestant, but yeah.
Yeah, let's imagine. So once again, this is kind of conditional, right? It depends on a number of factors which might change around the world, and I think people also have a very strong sense of identity, and the identity which is strong to them. I think most people wouldn't trade it for a different identity, even if it gave them benefits, right?
Yeah. This is like, for one, it's a bit of a repeat of the argument in J, where it's about the societal issues.
Yeah.
Brings up race and ethnicity and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
The discrimination based on these identifiers or traits, which you have no control over, right? Which is true, but it's contingent on the existence of racism.
Yeah, make antinatalist arguments that would stick in Star Trek. That's
exactly.
Where people can regenerate limbs, I think.
Let me think.
But maybe not. Oh no, the Trekkies are gonna get us now.
I'll take this debate. My track knowledge is not up to speed, but
all right.
I'll take it.
But it's like a classless, not genderless, but the classless, with full racial equality, full gender equality, etc., etc.
Like the way I always describe Star Trek is it's how liberals imagine socialism to be if it works out, right? That's Star Trek.
Well. Yes,
the fully automated luxury space communism.
Yeah,
right?
with the gay optional, but completely fine.
Yeah, like Star Trek's relationship with homosexuality is a difficult one. Maybe we can make this a separate episode because oh boy.
Yes.
But, yeah.
Letter O. The world is unstable, so it's unethical to reproduce. Even conditions are currently good, as that can significantly change in a short amount of time. Yeah, I think this is kind of ties up with the other ones, but it's a better argument than talking about climate change specifically, right? Because
it's less specific, and it probably holds up no matter what, because I personally can't imagine a future in which the world is like totally stable.
Yeah.
Where there's no possibility for change in either direction whatsoever.
Yeah. There are people who were born after the Spanish flu, which I know is not Spanish, influenza, and who died before COVID. So people who never experienced a pandemic, right?
Right.
To this extent. But those people also lived through two world wars probably. So,
Yeah. not exactly great.
Yeah. There's always something, and as a parent, and because antinatalism is about not creating children, like, as a parent, you don't know, right? You can't see, you make a baby. Let's imagine the baby usually will live to be an 80-year-old person and die, as most people in kind of advanced societies do. That's 80 years you can't absolutely predict, right?
Yeah, it's
impossible.
Again like a repetition of the argument from risk, which I think first got mentioned in argument B, that the future is uncertain, and if you're having a baby, you're taking a risk with this new person's life, right? That's essentially the argument.
All right, so let's finish this page. Oh my God. People who are born will need to take care of themselves through diet, exercise, staying healthy, maintaining financial security, fulfilling emotionally. Tasks are difficult to do. Creates a burden for people to lead a good life, or rather, I think the argument is that a good life is not given automatically, and regardless of circumstances, people have to work to create a good life, right? So the default the default life is not a good one unless you do stuff to make it good.
Yeah, I think we already had that one as well. Let me just check. Yeah, it's basically argument C again, that living is a struggle and requires a certain amount of effort.
Yeah.
To reach an acceptable quality of life.
Yeah.
Right?
I like this one better, even though it goes into a bit of kind of this stuff about diet, exercise, etc. It's very specific. They could have talked about, for example, the creation of meaning, right?
That's a more universal thing,
yeah.
which most people have to struggle with. There's presumably some people who never doubt that there is meaning in their life, but in my experience, most people will go through like a midlife crisis of some sort.
Yeah, and a teenage crisis as well.
Yeah.
And maybe other crises, right? Or people who are religious and who kind of get a prepackaged meaning to their lives and an ethical guide. Even they have their doubts, right? And that creates suffering and something they need to work at, right? Meaning is not given, The only thing that's given is like a desire to kind of create kind of homeostasis, not be cold, not be hot, have a safe place, feel safety at most times, not be hungry, not be thirsty, not have pain in your body, so protect yourself, etc. To me, those are more specific examples than saying diet, exercise, staying healthy.
Dieting and exercise is very specific again to like our current moment, I guess, depending on where you live. I doubt somebody who fought in the Somali civil war or whatever was particularly concerned with dieting and exercise, right?
Or if you're in Bangladesh now with the prospect of half your country disappearing underwater, maybe you're not thinking about your six-pack that much, right? Yeah, so...
But the basic argument is pretty good, I think, because yes, it's true, life is a struggle, you have to do shit in order to stay alive. This is definitely okay.
And then after you're taken care of staying alive, then your mind will wander about creating social bonds and having other human beings to talk to and communicate with somehow. And then your mind will go to, once you've secured that, your mind will go to, what's the purpose of life? What's meaning? Why do I wake up every day and do what I do? There's an endless task list for humans to be worried about and kind of burden themselves with these tasks.
Yeah, desire is really like it's a bottomless pit, right? It starts at like the very base level where it's about, nourishment, shelter, social, some kind of socialization because we're social animals and stuff, and then it just goes up the hierarchy list, if you want to put it in a hierarchy list.
And the hedonic treadmill, you start walking very slowly, but the thing speeds up. The more you walk, the faster it goes. And what gives you a kick yesterday doesn't give you a kick today. And there's always more, right? There's always more. I mean, that's the that's why we became the number one species in the world, right? Because of this kind of constant restlessness and kind of search for more and more meaning or more things. And this applies even to people who are who lead a very minimal lifestyle and very kind of frugal lifestyle. Even they have to kind of go through these issues as well. Just living a frugal lifestyle requires effort not to want things. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the paradoxes of Buddhism, I think. Like, how do you want not to want, right?
Yeah,
that's difficult.
Yeah, and anybody who's tried meditation knows how hard it is not to think about something you don't want to think about.
Oh yeah. Like it's a lot more difficult than you might think.
Yeah,
it's a lot more difficult to rid yourself of this base level desire and cognitive activity that's going on in your brain.
Yeah, and most of us will not. Could not lead a monastic life. Our egos or whatever would not let us be happy in that kind of lifestyle, and others would perhaps be content with leading a monastic life. But the monastic life requires other people to produce the food for you, other people to produce the electricity to warm up your monastery or whatever, right? So it ties up with the other
Yeah.
arguments on this list anyway.
Yeah, and that is like literally a remote monastery somewhere in the Himalayas or something where they grow their own food, presumably mostly.
I think it's the local villagers who bring it.
Yeah, that too. I mean, they're partly dependent on like gifts and stuff.
Yeah, so
it's not all you own. It's not total self-sufficiency.
Yeah, so you basically kind of bound into this existence that has all these demands. All right, we've passed an hour and we've done 2 pages, which is shocking.
Well, I'm pretty proud we managed at least 2 pages. That's not bad.
All right, so I think for next week we'll delve into the political religious arguments and the thought experiments.
Yeah, this is where it's gonna get wild and a little bit more contentious in my opinion, but yeah, that's gonna be for next week.
All right, so thanks very much for listening. Follow us or subscribe or whatever the button is in the platform we're using to listen to us. Feel free to send any comments or kind of things you think we should talk about to voidwavepodcast@gmail.com. And thanks very much for listening. Goodbye.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope our criticism was somewhat constructive. And yeah, talk to you guys next week. Bye-bye.